Welcome to The Detail. I am your host, Cathy Antunes, and you are listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota, Florida, and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton, Florida. And we are also recording this video and hope to post it online. So welcome, however you're listening, whether it's the broadcast, rebroadcast, the live broadcast, or on YouTube. With me today is Justin Bloom. He is the founder and a board member of Suncoast Waterkeeper. Justin, you've been visiting Sarasota for quite a while, made your home here, and then started this organization. Obviously, we've got water issues in Florida, but before we get to that, tell us why you started the organization. And I know you were involved up north also in Waterkeepers.
Yeah. Thanks, Cathy, and nice to join you again. I started Suncoast Waterkeeper, it's been about 10 years now. When I had returned to Sarasota after living in New York City and in New Orleans and kind of triangulating between those two places in Sarasota for a good number of years. I'd been working for Waterkeeper Alliance, which is the umbrella organization that provides support for waterkeepers around the world. So I was living in New York City, working as a director for Waterkeeper Alliance, and I tired of triangulating, wanted to live in one place, and that place that's most important to me is Sarasota. I've been connected to Sarasota since the 70s, when my grandparents retired to Anna Maria, and I've been, like you said, ever since I was a kid, been like a water rat in Sarasota Bay, and ultimately went to New College, and in the 80s, and since then it's been my home more than anywhere else. And I'd been working on a lot of environmental issues in other communities around the country, working with different organizations, and I wanted to get more local and protect the waterway that's most important to me and my favorite waterway, which is Sarasota Bay, and the waters in this region. So that prompted me to make a home again in Sarasota and start the organization. And I have a small practice and as a lawyer as well, which I maintain and work from my home here and live in the city of Sarasota.
So, I know we've seen you active with the county when there was an issue with the wastewater treatment plant out east of I-75 spilling millions of gallons of wastewater effluent, treated effluent into Philippi Creek. And you sued the county and they're cleaning that up, right? That Sarasota County is now responding. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that might have been the last time that I was that we talked on the radio. We were successful in bringing a case against Sarasota County. It's been a few years, and the focus of that was their largest wastewater treatment plant out at the end of Bee Ridge, which we discovered while I was really busy in litigation against the city of St. Petersburg over their failed sewage system. I decided to look in my backyard and realized that Sarasota County had, over the course of like 8-9 years, illegally discharged almost 1 billion gallons of highly nitrogenated, polluted wastewater into Sarasota Bay. Nobody knew about it. It was just this, it was incredible that this was flying under the radar. And we brought a case under the Clean Water Act to force them to stop that discharge and also to clean up their leaky sewage system. And so a couple of years later, I'm really happy to say that, number one, the county was very responsive compared to other municipalities that I've been in litigation with over these issues. They focused on solutions rather than litigation, and committed to upgrading that sewage system, the central or the northern sewage system, including Bee Ridge, which is their largest system. And now they are likely going to be upgrading other components of their sewage system to what we call advanced wastewater treatment, which is much more protective of the environment. It's an expensive investment in environmental infrastructure that, I feel our lawsuit kind of compelled them
Mhm.
to take that action, and they've been on track, and the system's been performing well. They've spent a lot of money and energy in moving towards that upgrade, and then they've been fixing their collection system to reduce those sewage spills that we see usually this time of year with severe weather,
Mhm.
where sometimes we'll see sewage spills kind of all throughout the county. So they're kind of
Yeah.
prioritizing repairs throughout the system, and I think they're
I,
doing a good job.
yeah, I'd have to say, uh, red tide is in the news now. Um, and the last really serious red tide incident was 2018, the summer of 2018.
Mhm.
Fish platoons of dead fish floating in our bay. And I think, that certainly woke up a lot of people in Sarasota to what was happening, which you had already started to realize and ultimately sued the county for. And, frankly, I guess that's what it takes sometimes to, compel a municipality to take care of a long-term problem, right? Because our water quality requires large long-term investments. So that was a terrific thing. That's Suncoast Waterkeepers, your efforts and your board's efforts. Um,
Thank you.
yeah, absolutely. We have another big problem that's already occurred, and your organization. We had Glenn Compton on the show back in the spring, and of
Great.
course, I'm talking about the breach at Piney Point, and how this breach, which began in late March and was allowing 2 to 3 million gallons of wastewater on top of Piney Point is a closed phosphogypsum plant. It's a facility where gypstacks or phosphogypsum waste from phosphate mining is stored. And I think most Floridians don't realize, Justin, how many stacks there are, how huge they are, the nature of this phosphate mining waste. On top of these stacks, it's the water retention ponds, and which keep the water from flowing through the stack and getting into the aquifer. Um, can you tell us, when you heard about the breach at Piney Point, a lot of organizations, Minnesota 88 in particular, because they've been around for decades, Glenn Compton's work, he's local to Manatee and Sarasota County. We've been hearing for years, Piney Point's a problem, Piney Point's a problem. But I think a lot of people weren't really focused on it. It's a long-term issue. But when you heard about the breach, tell me, what were your thoughts were? Were you surprised? Did you expect it? And why is it so important?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I'm glad that you had Glenn on the show. He's a great voice for environmental issues and environmental sanity in the community. And Minnesota 88
Yeah.
has been working on these issues for decades, like you said. Actually, when I was at New College, I volunteered for Gloria Rains, who was, I think, their founder back in the 80s. I think they started in the 70s, thinking that we'd be able to solve the problems by 1988. Here we are.
Yeah.
So it had been, and maybe one of the reasons why people just haven't really been up in arms about Piney Point over the years is that it's always been a smoking gun, a threat. And so every year around this time of year, in rainy season, the alarm is kind of, heightened, because, like you explained, you've got these massive gypstacks that are depositories of toxic phosphogypsum waste. it's not a byproduct, it's a waste.
And what's in it exactly? Let me stop you there, because what's it made of?
It's really like mining tailings. So they mine in these giant pits, typically in Central Florida and Bone Valley. And there aren't a lot of facilities that are located right on an estuary. They're typically inland, and most people don't know about them because they're out of sight, out of mind. If you fly across the state, then you can see them. They're in Bone Valley, kind of reaches up through the Mayaca Peace watersheds up in the center of the state, and there are 20 some of these gypstacks that
Can you explain Bone Valley? Because is phosphate is that from
Yeah, so
bones of?
Florida has some of the best known reserves of phosphate rich soils in the world. And so for a long time, over 100 years, there have been mining operations for phosphate. Other sources of historically, other sources of fertilizer and phosphate have been like some of the islands in the Caribbean where there are just deposits of like bird dung. They've
Oh,
mined
wow.
that, and
Really?
so phosphate rich soils that the operations are massive and incredibly destructive, but generally not seen because they're out east, where they basically dig up these giant pits of phosphate rich soil and treat it with acid to at this, like, technically I'm not going to be as good as Glenn is because he's been working on these issues for longer, but they process it to extract the phosphate, which then they usually will then transfer to a facility closer to a port, like in Tampa Bay, to process it so that it's marketable, or to get to a point where it's more pure phosphate that they can then ship out. And
So Justin, just to stop here for a minute, having the phosphate operation near the Port of Manatee, so we can then, because a lot of this phosphate, my understanding from Glenn is most of it is exported. It's important for agriculture. Other countries don't have the rich phosphate resources we do. And a lot of it goes to China and other countries. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I mean, it's an export industry. It doesn't provide very few jobs, and we don't really benefit from it. We get the burden of its pollution, which is really significant from cradle to grave. The impact on the lands where they do the mining, it devastates. They create a wasteland. They tout their success in remediating, and that they're stewards of the environment. I mean, you listen to their radio ads, you think that they're like an environmental nonprofit.
Yeah, it's like we're talking about Mosaic.
Yeah,
Their
Mosaic's
ads.
the biggest player. They're the biggest player. So it's incredibly destructive to the lands. They basically dig up the land, and they try to, and they've done some pretty cool things about trying to, remediate the land so that it has some habitat value. But it's they create a moonscape, and there are all these toxic overburden and chemicals that are remained to either be processed and recovered, or externalized, which means like polluted in Central Florida. I mean, the aquifer is severely polluted from these phosphate operations. So it's very destructive throughout, and we have phosphate is a big player in Florida and has been for many years. Piney Point wrapped up, they were a phosphate plant that has been closed. Well, not really closed. They've not been producing for many years. Not a Mosaic plant. It was owned by Mulberry Corporation, I believe, that went bankrupt.
Mulberry.
Had a history of some horrific spills at the Piney Point site, as well as up on the Alafia. Forgive me if anybody that lives up on the river, how I mispronounce it. The plant that they had on that river had terrible pollution events that killed that river. Piney Point has a significant history of major pollution events. And the company ultimately went bankrupt, and the state took it over and has been pretty much managing it ever since.
Well, but here's the thing I wanted to ask you. You know, the State Department of Environmental Protection owned the facility and cleaned it up on our dime from 2001 to 2004. But then they sold it to a company called HRK Holdings in 2004. So, you know, we want to talk a little more later too about the nature of these stacks, but taxpayers paid millions of dollars to clean this up. And then instead of keeping it under the DEP control, they sold it to HRK Holdings, who still owns it today, with the expectation that HRK Holdings was going to be responsible for protecting the bay and keeping these retention ponds that sit at the top of the stacks, hold the water so it doesn't filter through all the contaminated waste. These are 70 feet high, full of contamination. If the water's allowed to filter through, it goes, all this waste, and some of it's radioactive, would get into the aquifer. You know, I think these days we're so used to a mantra that the private sector can do a better job than the public sector. But really, does the private sector have an incentive to spend the money to do the right thing? It's just you know, with HRK Holdings obviously didn't do everything they needed to. I mean, the breach happened. It was rather serious. So I'm just curious, because you all are suing HRK Holdings, right, and
they're
the state.
As is the Manatee County Port Authority, as is the DEP, as is the governor. And I think they all share some responsibility here. But I am clearly saying very strongly that the entity that is the most responsible, that needs to be the most accountable, is the state and the DEP. HRK, you know, everybody wants to point a finger. There are a lot of fingers, a lot of targets, and sure, HRK is one of them, but their operations were pretty limited, and DEP held the reins, tightly controlled what from the very beginning, what was to occur at Piney Point. And HRK's job was pretty much to like sell off, to follow through on the state controlled, approved of closure plan, which is a joke, and to abide by an agreement to follow through on the state actions. The state hired contractors to come up with a operational and closure plan, and HRK's job was to follow the state's orders on this. And even when it comes to any expenditure of money had to be approved by the state. The state was like guiding this whole process and was in control of it, was regulating it, was supposed to be enforcing it, and they dropped the ball a long time ago and never picked it up. I just really want to make sure that you know, not that, I mean, HRK has their role and shares some of the responsibility, but I think that the problem here really is historic failure to adequately regulate this industry by the state of Florida.
Yeah, and you know, let me clarify. I think it's absurd to expect a private company to do a job that properly belongs, I think, with the DEP, with the state. I'm just going to pull up some information. This is on your website, on the Suncoast Waterkeeper website. there's information from a presentation. Can you see that, Justin,
Yeah.
on the screen? Okay. And this was just months before the breach. So John Coates, who gave the presentation, he is with the Department of Environmental Protection. And I believe this presentation was given to the Manatee Board of County Commissioners. But it was about the state of the ponds. And I just pulled up one slide, Justin. And, for those who are listening and can't see the video, what this slide shows is there are 3 retention ponds. And over time, from 2013 to 2020, November of 2020, late November, the 25th, you see how many millions of gallons were being held in these ponds, to where, steadily increasing over the years. And in November of 2020, there are 751 million gallons of wastewater that has radioactive, potentially radioactive contamination, heavy metals, nitrogen, phosphorus. Do you know, I couldn't really tell, Justin, what the capacity is compared to how much was in there. But it just seems like the amount of wastewater just kept going up and up and up.
Right. Well, and the reason why is that these are open. I don't know how many hundreds of acres. I forget how many acres. This is a massive site that basically, it kept on receiving rainwater.
Yeah.
So you asked me kind of like whether I was surprised, and the history, like every rainy season, everybody gets really concerned about Piney Point because these ponds keep on getting to the point where they're running out of capacity, running out of space, and like the next rain event might be the next, the straw that breaks the camel's back, or the breaches the containment. And so, you can see all the way back in 2013, there was still like way too much wastewater, and it's stormwater, like you said, mixed with processed water, and it's a soup that has no business being in the bay or in our aquifer. And there's a really, really important juncture that I want to kind of focus on, where, like I said, the state was in control of this facility, and they had many different opportunities to close it, to finally close it, to take out and process through reverse osmosis or evaporation. They had a laundry list of ways to take out the remaining wastewater. And back then, many years ago, it was a lot less than it is now, or was this spring. And they never did. They decided at this critical juncture to allow it to, rather than close it and remediate it, and they bought into a scheme to allow it to receive dredge material from the nearby Port of Manatee that wanted to expand one of their berths to receive Panamax vessels. This is back then. And so somebody came up with this idea to, like, hey, Piney Point's right nearby. Let's take all this dredge spoil and put it up on top of these stacks.
And was that the reason HRK was interested? They wanted to create another berth in the Port of Manatee
No,
and use. Okay.
No, I mean, that was, I think the county was pushing for, the Port Authority. And it, like, on superficially, it sounds like, hey, that's reasonable idea. You've got this, toxic waste depository, and why not cap it with some relatively benign dredge spoil. But it was a horrible idea. And the Army Corps of Engineers said just that. This is a terrible idea. Don't do it. And, that wasn't the answer that the county and the state wanted to hear. So they hired their own consultants to tell them what they wanted to hear. And then the Corps reviewed their findings and said, this is a bad idea. Don't do it. And these are the national experts.
Mm-hmm.
And then they basically said, you do it, we're washing our hands of it.
It's on. So in other words, we lost the federal support. The Army Corps said, that's it, you're on your own.
They said, like, don't come back on us if this thing fails, because we're afraid it's going to fail, because you've got this giant gypstack that you described, 70 some feet high. It's not an engineered structure. It's a dome of toxic hazardous waste, spoil from mining operations.
Just sitting on top of the land. Yeah.
And on top of that, you've got these ponds. And so they engineered a pond system that has a liner to keep the rainwater and wastewater from going through the gypstack and, and bringing, as it goes through, picking up the toxic wastes that are in the mining tailings, including the radioactive and other hazardous wastes, which would then potentially go into the aquifer or into surface waters. And so they lined the top, but they lined it with this engineered lining solution, which had been known to fail in other cases.
Wow.
And has failed.
Wow.
On many occasions at Piney Point. And so on top of this failed liner system, they put all this dredge spoil. And over the years, the liner system has torn and failed. And meanwhile, all this additional stormwater has accumulated to the point where it threatened the integrity on a number of occasions, but most recently in the spring, it got to the point where it threatened the integrity of the whole gypstack, and they were afraid that the whole thing was going to collapse.
So Justin, let me just go back to this presentation, and can you see that slide? So in 2018, according to Mr. Coates, who gave the presentation, the Department of Environmental Protection, in 2018, there was a 148 million gallon capacity left in these 3 ponds, which would have been able to absorb or, contain a 46-inch rainfall. So, significant capacity, but not like it's unlimited. Then in 2020, the capacity, so this is the tail end of the year. I'm not sure when this measurement was taken. The presentation was given in December of 2020. The capacity had dwindled down by the end of 2020 to 9.7 inches of rainfall, which, in Florida, that's nothing, right? I mean, it's going to happen eventually. You're going to get 9.7 inches. Wasn't this completely foreseeable even in 2020 that there was going to be a problem with capacity?
Yeah, and actually, the Manatee County delegation made it their priority. But there's this history of not really having any particular entity take responsibility, and I think that responsibility should have been borne and should be borne by the state. But the county delegation said, "Hey, we're really worried about this. Let's get something done here." And then again, we go through this process that had occurred at several other junctures over the last several decades of okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to close it? What are all the options? Let's hire some consultants. And too late.
Yeah,
it's just too late at that point. Then, so what I was saying is that there was a imminent breach, that the containment was failing and did fail, and to avoid a catastrophic deluge of hundreds and hundreds of millions of gallons of wastewater, they engineered a contained release of 215 million gallons of highly polluted wastewater. To relieve that pressure, they piped it into the bay. And so over the course of 10 days, they intentionally discharged 215 million gallons of wastewater.
of wastewater. If you're just joining us, you're listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5, LPFM in Sarasota, Florida, and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton, Florida. Joining me today is Justin Bloom with Suncoast Waterkeeper, and we are talking about the lawsuit that Suncoast Waterkeeper has brought against the state and the DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, HRK Holdings, regarding the failure at Piney Point. But to remind, just a public service, if drinking is no longer fun for you and separates you from other people, you can attend an AA meeting. They've been there. More information is available by phone at 941-951-6810 or online at aasrq.org. So Justin, this breach happened in March, late March of 2021. There was 2 to 3 million gallons a day were going into the bay from the breach itself. Then their models predicted that it could really fail. And Scott Hopes, who is the Manatee County administrator, on April 3rd, the models they were using predicted a 20-foot wall of water could potentially be released from these ponds. And there was an evacuation ordered of 316 homes. Part of US 41 was closed in Hillsborough County and Manatee County. And then as you said, they actually brought in the National Guard. Governor DeSantis came and they installed pumps to do this controlled release into Tampa Bay. There's a video on YouTube showing in Bishop Harbor, which I suppose is like immediately right at the site of the breach, yellow water, and basically there was no life in the bay. And right now, and people were predicting, because yes, there's contamination in there, there's heavy metals, but there's a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus, which feeds red tide. And so Glenn Compton, the head of Minnesota 88, others were warning, experts in marine life were saying this could be a catastrophe for the marine life in Tampa Bay and surrounding areas. We've been hearing about fish kills in St. Pete. They've removed 676 tons of dead fish in Pinellas County. 470 tons of that was in St. Pete. That was a recent report. Should we be surprised? Is this the inevitable outcome from 215 gallons of wastewater from a phosphogypsum stack?
Yeah, I think that this is the result. I think there's a direct correlation between 215 million gallons in 10 days during a period of time in the spring when it was the worst possible time for all that nitrogen to go into Tampa Bay. There's very little capacity, particularly that time of year, to absorb the harm from that. And the scientific community really was very alarmed, and nobody really knew exactly what was going to happen. USF did some tracking of where they anticipated that the plume would be flowing and mixing in throughout Tampa Bay and into Sarasota Bay and into the Gulf. But the dynamics of the estuary and the capacity to absorb pollutants is very complex. And I think there was that significant fear that it was going to create an environmental catastrophe of harmful algae blooms. And we did start seeing shortly afterwards some harmful algae blooms, not red tide, but Lyngbia-like blooms in the area of Piney Point, then in through Terracea and into Anna Maria Sound. And we had really bad Lyngbia bloom in northern, in Manatee County that impacted Anna Maria, Northwest Bradenton, Sneed, Palmetto, Terracea. That
Mhm.
dissipated after a while, and then the red tide. And so, there's the mantra that we heard years ago was that red tide is naturally occurring, period.
Yeah,
And so I
right.
think we've grown up a bit. We collectively, and particularly the state and our leaders and resource managers are now acknowledging the red tide is naturally occurring, but fueled by human anthropogenic sources of nitrogen pollution. And so, the red tide, unfortunately, we see it pretty much every year in low or medium concentrations.
Mhm.
Um, and back through his recorded history, we've had history of red tides. But when red tide comes in close enough to shore to be influenced by uh, nitrogenated coastal waters, it there's a feeding frenzy. It can be a
It
feeding frenzy. It's
it's
like
a perfect storm for red.
we hear about the fires out west. A brush fire under normal conditions can kind of extinguish itself. It'll run out of fuel. But if you got like an area littered with newspaper and um, dry brush, it's going to take off. And this is
Mhm.
a good analogy, I think, to what has happened here is that the red tide kind of slowly makes its way up the coast. We see, I think it's influenced somewhat by the Caloosahatchee and the flows from Lake Okeechobee, the blue-green algae and highly nitrogen dies along with all the nitrogen coming in to the estuary there, going out into the Gulf. And there's a slow march up the coast normally. And this time it caught fire with all
Mhm.
the nitrogen released from Piney Point, um, circulating its way around in the bay, made for perfect conditions for a terrible red tide. And so I do think that there's a direct correlation. We won't be able to show a judge a smoking gun because I don't think the science is there
No.
to be able to show a DNA, correlation between this dead fish or this red tide bloom and the wastewater that came out of Piney Point. But pretty much everybody in the scientific community acknowledges that like this this was like the worst thing that could happen, and they think that Piney Point was the significant fuel for this
Yeah,
fire.
the catalyst. And um, we're hearing reports in the state of Florida between January of this year and July 2nd. The manatee mortality count is broken the record of 2013. In 2013, in the whole year, we had 843, or I'm sorry, 834 manatees died in 2013 in Florida. Um, just this year, 6 months, so from January through the beginning of July, we have 841 dead manatees in Florida that have been documented. Actually, most of these are on the East Coast. You know, I'm curious what the picture may be for the West Coast. What's going on, if you're aware, with the conditions for manatees here? Because that Tico power plant, of course, we have so much, manatees just in Sarasota Bay, but there's a huge population of them in Tampa Bay. They hang out in that power plant. This is all um, been affected by the Piney Point
Yeah,
discharge.
I mean, even without Piney Point, we we could have had this interview and I without Piney Point, and I would be super alarmed about the conditions in our bays because even before Piney Point, we over the last several years we've seen significant historic reductions in our seagrass populations, which is the primary habitat and food source for manatees.
Hmm.
And it's not just manatees. I mean, honestly, I'm more concerned about all the whole web of marine life that thrives and relies on a healthy waterway, be it Sarasota or Tampa Bay, and the seagrass is what kind of ties it all together. And we've seen these historic reductions over the last few years in Sarasota and Tampa Bay of a die-off of seagrass, which is certainly going to affect manatee populations. We haven't seen the mortality that we see over in the East Coast, and it might take a while, but I mean, the big event on the East Coast was basically the death of the Indian River Lagoon and the death of all their seagrasses. And they're tying it to these mortalities to a reduced source of food. And so, we've lost a tremendous amount of our seagrass meadows, and this red tide is going to compound that. And, so it's not looking good for manatee populations, and the red tide that's going on now will kill manatees. And they've fished out dead manatees along with the, massive amount of other dead fish and marine life up in Tampa Bay. So it's toxic to manatees that are already,
Yeah.
impaired. And the policy point here for me is like, there's been this effort over the last many years to delist the manatee from the endangered species list. And I think that we need to strengthen the protections of manatees because they are imperiled.
Yeah, they are imperiled. And those seabeds, they are by definition coastal, right? Manatees can't just go out to the middle of the Gulf and feed there. That they're not going to find their food source. And they need to stay where it's warm, right? They don't go into cooler waters.
They travel quite amazingly. They really do. They're pretty mobile, as slow as they are. I mean, I think that their primary source of food is seagrasses. I mean, I think that they're somewhat adaptable and they can eat other things, but and we're seeing a conversion of like seagrass meadows into other types of algae, which are not as productive, let's say, but might be a food source for manatees to help mitigate that. But whether that is healthy, that might be contributing to some of the mortality. I'm not sure, but it ain't good.
No, and it's certainly not how manatees have thrived in Florida for hundreds of years. They eat seagrass. I want to shift a bit to the economics of phosphate mining. Glenn Compton has been quoted, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says he really doesn't see that there's an economically feasible way to close a gypstack. That, in other words, what I'm wondering is, for all of the profit that a particular company may realize by phosphate mining, when you look at what's happening with the total cost, the cost of closing the mine, how long this waste is with us. And I'd be really curious for you to share, how long is this waste with us?
Forever.
Yeah. So how can the profitability of phosphate mining be justified when you have to deal with the waste forever? Because that radioactive component, like, what do you do?
I think that they need to internalize, and I don't know if they can, as an industry, internalize the pollution costs. And to do that, fertilizer is going to be more expensive, and we got a lot of people to feed. So it's no easy answer to it. A lot of people want to just like stop phosphate mining, period, because it's bad, and I don't like it. But and of course, I mean, I support regenerative agriculture and better conservation techniques and ways of reducing our reliance on large scale reliance on phosphorus and fertilizer. But there's no real easy answer here. But I think that, we're talking about the economics of it. You got to take into account the economic costs of the pollution and balance that on a societal level, to force them, and then ultimately force them to internalize the costs of pollution, to not let it enter the environment. And so that's gonna, I think, put a lot of pressure on the phosphate industry to be more efficient And they'll probably have to raise the cost of phosphorus if, large scale. We're going to, compel the state to better regulate the phosphate industry
Yeah.
moving forward.
Yeah. So what is, well, and just as an aside, but it is such an important component of agriculture. We should be looking for substitutes though, because of the waste problem with phosphorus. But I've talked with people who say as a national security issue, is this something it's a finite resource. Is it something we really want to just, sell without any consideration that we may need this ourselves someday? It's just something to think about. But Justin, what can we expect in terms of this lawsuit timeline? And I imagine it's going to take a while. How do you foresee that?
Yeah, hopefully not. I mean, these lawsuits can take a very long time. Our case against St. Pete dragged on for years over their sewage problems. I think we're going to make every effort to bring about some change as soon as possible through this lawsuit. So, I mean, there will be opportunities. I think that we will bring forward opportunities for immediate remedial measures to close. I mean, our goal is to make sure that there's a full and final closure of that plant. And along with that, environmental remediation, and I think that, and to stop the current plan right now is to just dump it all into the aquifer in Manatee County. Manatee County is seeking a permit from the state for a deep injection well where they plan to, and there's no talk about how they're going to treat the remaining waste, which is much worse than what already went into the bay, to just dump it into the ground, into the aquifer.
Wow.
So that we want to have transparency. We want to have a seat at the table. We want the best available science and technology to come up with a reasonable, good plan for closure. And we want that to happen as soon as possible. So hopefully we can come up with a strategy. Hopefully collaboratively, the parties can come up with a strategy to get there rather than just focus our energies on litigation, which is quite often not the most productive way.
Yeah.
So let's focus on solutions. I'm not saying that the state is not, looking for solutions. And I'm really encouraged by the appointment of Mark Rains as the state's chief science officer. I think he's great, and I'm sure that they're working hard, but it's all behind closed doors. And we don't have faith because of the track record of the state in screwing this up. We think that the public, and we hope to represent the public in this, needs a seat at the table to make sure that there is an adequate, full, final closure and remediation at Piney Point. And we want it to go beyond that, to look further. I mean, this could be hopefully a precedential case on how to adequately regulate phosphate throughout the state of Florida and maybe beyond.
Yeah. And as we shared in the beginning, there are 25 gypsum stacks in the state of Florida. These are massive repositories of phosphate mining waste. This problem isn't going away. We do need to find a way to deal with this waste. So Justin Bloom, thank you so much for being with me today. If people want to learn more about Suncoast Waterkeeper, if they want to join, if they want to contribute, how do they find out more?
Well, we're having a forum actually on Friday. Go to our website, suncoastwaterkeeper.org, or check us out on Facebook. We, along with the Tampa Bay Waterkeeper, which I also encourage people to look into, especially if you're living in the north of here in Tampa Bay or in northern Manatee County. We're having a forum with the executive director of the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program, the executive director of the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, and on Friday at the Bradenton Yacht Club up on the Manatee River, where I think a lot of these issues are going to be addressed, and we're going to just hopefully provide a forum for more information for the public and for resource managers. But
so this is July 23rd, Friday, July 23rd, 2021.
This Friday.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
go to our website, and we have a page about that forum. And please support our efforts. We are seeking members. We're seeking financial contributions. I mean, the work that we do an incredible amount with just a volunteer board of directors. We don't have we don't have an executive director. We want to build our capacity to where we can hire an executive director and be able to do more. And the money that we need right now is to be able to help pay for the litigation and to be able to hire good experts to help us to prove our case. So all the costs they're pretty high. So we need some help.
Yeah, well, and when you think about how important clean water is, I mean, this is about our drinking water. This is about our economy, right? All the people who make their living taking people fishing, restaurants on the water, just there's so much out there in Florida. I mean, this is why people come here. So if we're ruining it and not doing what we need to do to protect our home, it's really on us. Justin, thank you for being with me, for your efforts. Check out suncoastwaterkeeper.org, everyone. You've been listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5, LPFM in Sarasota, Florida, and WBPV 100.1 LPFM in Bradenton, Florida. If drinking is no longer fun for you and separates you from other people, you can attend an AA meeting. They've been there. More information is available by phone at 941-951-6810 or online at aasrq.org. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone, and make it a great day. Take care.